Luna Seawold, and this is Authentic Parenting, a podcast about personal development in the context of parenting, where I explore how you can find more calm, connection, and joy in parenting through the process of self-discovery and inner growth with a trauma-informed lens. I'm a parent educator, and my mission is to help children by helping parents. The motto of this podcast is raising our children, growing ourselves. Do you suffer from anxiety? I do. And I'm always looking for ways to not only understand my anxiety, but to find relief, because anxiety doesn't feel good. I can't remember what my anxiety was like when I was younger, but I know for sure in the past few years, it has gotten worse to a degree that I get panic attacks, quote unquote, out of nowhere. In my efforts to find help for my anxiety and panic attacks, I have discovered various authors, books, and programs. And FYI, I have never taken medication for my anxiety. I know that hormonal imbalances can cause symptoms of anxiety. Low estrogen, low progesterone, thyroid dysfunction, insulin resistance, and dysregulated cortisol, the stress hormone, can contribute to high levels of anxiety, especially for perimenopausal and menopausal women. And I know that removing caffeine and eliminating certain foods, such as dairy and gluten, can be very helpful. I have seen this firsthand in my life. I have heard that anxiety can stem from loss and grief. I learned that when I read Claire Bidwell Smith's book, Anxiety, The Missing Stage of Grief. And by the way, Claire will be on the podcast soon. I also learned about anxiety and dysfunctional breathing from Patrick McKeown's book, The Breathing Cure. He was a recent guest in episode 305, Breathing and Your Health. A fantastic episode you really want to listen to. But what if I told you that anxiety is a habit? Would you be surprised? I was when I first discovered Dr. Jud's work. But once I familiarized myself with his work, read his book, and learned more, it made sense. Dr. Jud Brewer is a New York Times bestselling author, neuroscientist, addiction psychiatrist, MD, PhD, and thought leader in the field of habit change. He's the Director of Research and Innovation at Brown University's Mindfulness Center, where he also serves as an Associate Professor of Behavioral and Social Sciences in the School of Public Health. He's the Executive Medical Director of Behavioral Health at ShareCare, a digital health company, and a research affiliate at MIT. Dr. Jud has developed and tested novel mindfulness programs for habit change, including treatments for smoking, emotional eating, and anxiety. They have developed 3 apps that you can find in the App Store: Eat Right Now, Craving to Quit, and Unwinding Anxiety. He's the author of Unwinding Anxiety. New science shows how to break the cycles of worry and fear to heal your mind. And his first book, The Craving Mind, From Cigarettes to Smartphones to Love, Why We Get Hooked and How We Can Break Bad Habits. His 2016 TED Talk, A Simple Way to Break a Bad Habit, has been viewed 16 million times. Dr. Jud has developed a breakthrough, step-by-step, clinically proven guide to alleviate anxiety. Dr. Jud explains that we can't think our way out of or use willpower to overcome anxiety. He teaches us how to map our brains to discover our triggers, diffuse them with simple but powerful practice of curiosity, and train our brains using mindfulness and other practices that his lab has proven can work. I haven't had an anxiety attack since this interview, so I hadn't had a chance to put into practice what I learned from his method. This is one fascinating interview, super packed with great information, and you're going to learn so much about how your brain works and what unwinding anxiety looks like. I have to say that in the 6 years of podcasting and interviewing people, this is the only time that upon completion, I was left with more questions than I started. And I was really prepared for this interview. Please enjoy this fantastic interview with internationally renowned addiction psychiatrist, neuroscientist, Jud Brewer. Dr. Jud, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
I'm delighted to start this conversation about anxiety, as I have grown to be very anxious in the past years and even had a few panic attacks, if you can believe it. But first, I think it would be good to define what anxiety is, even though most people know it. Mm-hmm. Probably intuitively, they don't need a definition, but I think it's good to define things as we talk about them.
Sure. So one of the classic definitions is a feeling of nervousness or worry or unease about an imminent event or something with an uncertain outcome. I think of it as fear of the future. Yeah.
Okay, and we'll have that. So when does anxiety turn into a disorder? Because there's anxious states, right? Mm-hmm. We all feel anxiety at times. Mm-hmm. There's anxiety disorder, there's panic disorder. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, if we think of disorders, and I don't like the term disorder in general, but that's the nomenclature that the billing people have come up with so they can, we can bill for our services. So here it is. So if you think of these diagnostic criteria, whether it's panic disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, whatever, one of the common elements is when it leads to severe dysfunction. So if it's really getting in the way of our personal life, of our work life, of our relationships, or all of the above, that's when people tend to be referred to a psychiatrist or a therapist.
I see. How does anxiety show up in the brain? What does it look like for the person? Because anxiety is way different than fear, right?
It is. So, and there are many layers that we can look at. If you think of the survival mechanisms in the brain, for example, the amygdala is mischaracterized as like the fear part of the brain. I was just at a radio show with Joe Ledoux, who's the world's expert on the amygdala. And the first thing he said was, look, everybody mischaracterizes the amygdala. It's really there to help us pay attention so we can determine if something is dangerous or not, which is the way I understand it as well. He would know. So we can think of the brain as helping us survive. And, there are many parts of the brain that help with the survival, starting with the orienting us toward the rustle in the bushes so that we can pay attention to it and see it. Do I need to run away from that? Or is that just my family member goofing around? And so lots of brain structures involved in fear and learning mechanisms there. If we look at kind of the past and the future, because fear is about the present moment. It's about, am I in danger right now? Do I need to do something? If we think about anxiety, which is more fear of the future, we're not necessarily and generally not in danger right now. Our brain is saying, hey, could this be dangerous, or is there some situation where I could be in danger later? That's the way our survival brain is thinking about it. So it's kind of mushing together these fear learning mechanisms with other types of learning mechanisms that involve things like the prefrontal cortex. And that, the prefrontal cortex seems to be one of the seats of where we think and plan for the future. So also helpful for survival, thinking and planning. Yet when you mush those two together, fear plus future, the lines get crossed and we start worrying about the future, which isn't actually helpful for survival. So there's a network of brain regions called the default mode network that gets activated when we think about the past or the future. And particularly it gets activated when we are worried. The more we worry, the more at least two hubs of the default mode network, the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex, get activated. Now, the posterior cingulate in particular is interesting because it not only gets activated when we worry about the future, but that activation has been shown to also be present when people are craving substances, everything from cigarettes to chocolate to cocaine, and also when they're ruminating about the past. So, in fact, my lab's done a bunch of research looking at how meditators, brains look different than non-meditators. And in fact, we found that this is true. When people get caught up in their experience, the default mode network or the posterior cingulate in particular is activated. But interestingly, when people are mindful, when they're aware, when they're present, when they're not caught up in experience, this network of brain regions gets really quiet.
That's what I was going to ask. This default mode network is not completely a useless region, right? In the brain. It's not a completely useless network.
There are probably no useless networks in our brain. We don't have enough real estate to have a bunch. It's like the appendix in the gut. It doesn't really get in the way, and so it's just hanging out and causes problems for a few people when they get appendicitis. But I doubt our brain has any extra real estate.
So what is it always active and sometimes it becomes quiet? And what makes it quiet besides mindfulness or meditation? Are there any activities that we do that makes this default mode network quiet?
That's a great question. So some people have found that the default mode network gets quiet when people are concentrated on something. And there have been a number of different studies. It doesn't matter what you're concentrated on, as long as it's not too challenging, probably. When somebody's concentrated, when somebody's focused, as compared to when they're mind wandering. When somebody's mind wandering, it gets active. When they're not mind wandering, it quiets down. And there have also been studies. So this network gets activated quite a bit. In fact, historically, it was a really interesting story where Marcus Rakel and his group at Washington University in St. Louis, they discovered this network accidentally. They had come up with a very simple task, which was lie still and don't do anything in particular. And they thought this task was not going to do anything in particular to the brain. And so they were using it as a control task against which they would compare their active conditions, the things they were really interested in. Yet they found that over and over and over and over, people were activating this network, this default mode network, when they were not doing anything in particular, which is why they named it the default mode network. And then it took years to figure out exactly what was happening when people weren't doing anything in particular. And the long and short of it is, I think of it as the me network. We tend to think about ourselves. So, we think about something we've done earlier if we're just not doing anything in particular, or we start thinking about the future, and what we might be doing later. And so it's called the default mode network. But it's really involved in self-reference when we're thinking about ourselves, past or future, when we're worrying, what's going to happen to me in the future, when we're ruminating, when we're depressed, for example, that tends to be self-referential as well. So this network is active quite a bit. You could estimate, indirectly that it's activated probably at least 50% of waking life. If you link up some of the, the mind wandering studies and the default mode network studies, it might even be active more than that if you add up all the times that we're thinking about ourselves, which is unfortunately quite a bit. So you can think of it as, it's whenever we're doing something related to ourselves or thinking about something related to ourselves is activated. And then when we are moving away from self-reference, it gets deactivated. And if we double click on that, my lab has done some neurophenomenologic studies where we've given people feedback from their brains in real time as we've looked at their brain activity, so we can really zoom in and see, what is it about the posterior cingulate, for example, in particular, that gets activated. And it looks like anything that causes us to get caught up in our experience. So this is where everything from craving to worrying to ruminating to thinking about, choices that we've made and liking them, and the list goes on and on and on. All of these share one common feature, which is getting caught up in our experience. And you can feel what it feels like to get caught up. There's like a little bit of a contraction. It's like, ooh, I got a bunch of likes on Instagram. That activates the default mode network. And we feel that little jolt of excitement, that little contraction. And then in contrast to that, many things like being curious, like being kind. My lab did a study specifically on loving kindness meditation and found that in particular deactivates the default mode network because it's not about me getting something. It's about just sharing the love, so to speak. It's about kindness, and kindness isn't about ourselves, even when we are being kind to ourselves.
I see. When you say caught up in an experience, does it matter if it's a negative or positive experience?
It doesn't. In fact, my friend Dana Small, who's a food researcher at Yale, she did a study with chocolate where she would scan people's brains as she fed them chocolate. She did this with a PET scanner, and she gave people their favorite chocolate. And so she found that people's posterior cingulate, for example, is activated right at the beginning of the experiment when they were rating, oh, this is great. I'm getting fed my favorite chocolate and I'm getting paid to do this. And then also she would just feed them until they were absolutely disgusted with it. And so when they were pushing it away, thinking, oh, this is terrible, I can't eat another bite, they were also activating their posterior cingulate. So I think it's that contraction of, ooh, I want more, or ooh, get this, I want less, get this out of here. Both of those activate the posterior cingulate. So I think it's that contraction that comes with wanting more or wanting less.
How does trauma affect this default mode network? Because people who have experienced trauma, they are self-referential, preoccupied, right? Are there studies that look at the difference between a traumatized brain and a non-traumatized in terms of this default mode network?
I'm sure there are. I'm not an expert on the trauma literature, so somebody else could probably answer this much better than I could. In short, I know some of the studies, and I think if I remember correctly, when we have that recollection, either the intrusive thoughts or the nightmare or something like that, that can activate the default mode network because we're getting caught up in that experience. And we also, if it's unpleasant, so we're often trying to avoid that experience as well. And that caught upness, whether it's getting caught up in the thought or the nightmare, or just trying to avoid it, both of those involve, getting caught up to one degree or another.
Yeah. So let's talk about your work, Unwinding Anxiety, the book. When I first read that anxiety is a habit, right? It's very surprising when you read that, but it totally makes sense after you familiarize yourself with your work. So I would love for you to speak about that. How come anxiety is a habit? Why do we form this habit? And how did you make that connection in the first place? That's interesting too, I think.
Yes. Well, I have to say, if there was one thing that I wish I had learned in medical school that I didn't, it was this. That anxiety could be driven like a habit. And the reason for that is, I was trained in medical school to prescribe medications to my patients with anxiety. And if you look at the data, it's about 1 in 5. The actual number is 5.2. It's called the number needed to treat. So it's about 1 in 5 patients that shows a significant reduction in symptoms when they get the best medications for anxiety. So I'm basically playing the medication lottery. 1 in 5 of my patients is going to show a significant reduction in symptoms. And I don't know which one of those 5, the next 5 that I treat it's going to be. Hopefully down the road, we'll do a better job at that. But that's years down the road. So here I am playing the medication lottery, and I don't know what to do with the other 4 out of 5, the other 80% that aren't doing as well as the 20%. So I started getting anxious about how to treat my patients with anxiety. Like, how am I going to help these folks? And I had been doing, my lab it first started this work at Yale, but now my lab's at Brown. We've been studying habit change, very interested as an addiction psychiatrist, how to help my patients quit smoking, for example. And so we'd done some research with mindfulness training where we'd gotten 5 times the quit rates of gold standard treatment. So that was, that was promising. We were pretty excited about that. That was early on, some of our first studies that were relatively small. But we had been doing more work with eating, helping people who were struggling with emotionally eating or overeating. We'd even developed an app called Eat Right Now, and we were studying that. And somebody in that program said to me, I'm mapping out my habit loops around eating, and it looks like anxiety triggers me to eat. Could you create an app for anxiety? And I was thinking, well, I prescribe medications, but it put a bug in my ear. And then I started looking back at the literature, and it turns out that Thomas Borkovec and others had talked about anxiety as a negatively reinforced behavior back in the 1980s. And when I hear negative reinforcement, I hear habit, because that's how we form habits, is through negative reinforcement. And that just, I just had this light bulb moment where I was thinking, wow, I've never thought about anxiety like a habit before. Let me see, it made sense. Just like you say, when you say it makes sense. It made sense to me. But the other part of that light bulb moment, the thing that gave it electricity was, I know, I'd been studying how to work with habits. And so I was thinking, wow, we could put these two together. Let's, here's this light bulb, let's add some juice. So we developed this app called Unwinding Anxiety. This is an app anybody can download and use. And we basically built in this basic premise, starting with helping people learn how anxiety is formed as a habit loop. So for example, and this could be anxiety, this could be panic, this could be anything. I'll give an example. So you need 3 elements to form any habit: a trigger, a behavior, and a result. And I had a patient, I actually wrote about him in my Unwinding Anxiety book, and call him Dave. I had a patient who was referred to me for anxiety. And when I started taking his history, I was thinking about these 3 elements. I was looking for them to see if I could hear any elements of a habit loop. And he started talking about how he had panic, and he would get panic attacks. He couldn't drive on the highway anymore. And so I asked him, what is it that made him not drive on the highway anymore? And he said, well, I would have these thoughts, maybe I'll get in a car accident. So there was the trigger. And then his behavior was avoiding driving on the highway. And the results, and from a brain perspective, the reward was that he could avoid having panic attacks. And so I just wrote these 3 things down on a piece of paper and then drew arrows between them. Trigger leads to the behavior, leads to the reward, and then the arrow back up to the trigger. And I said, look, is this what's going on? And I just repeated it. And he said, yeah. And I said, look, can you see how this is actually a habit? You've developed this process that helps you avoid having panic attacks. And his eyes got really wide, and he said, oh, I had no idea, because he didn't know how his brain worked. That's the first step for anybody, is to, you've got to know how your mind works in order to be able to work with your mind. And so that was the beginning for him. Long story short, for him, he used our app, ended up about 6 months later, I saw him this is in Providence, Rhode Island, on Main Street. I was walking out of class one day, and this car pulls up, and he rolls down. It's him. He rolls down his window and he goes, hey, doc, I'm an Uber driver now. I'm headed to the airport. So he did pretty well.
It's an incredible story. I when I got to that point in the book, I'm like, wow, this is pretty incredible, and very, very hopeful for the rest of us, right, who struggle with this. I tried mapping out my anxieties. My anxieties, and we can use myself as an example if you don't mind. I don't mind. I would love to get your help on the podcast. So my anxieties are around medical procedures and things of that nature, health related. Mm-hmm. So I can't even get a blood work done now. It's that severe, because the last time, well, I mean, it's a bit of a long story, but it gives context. Mm-hmm. I was in the store one day, two years ago, I think, before the pandemic started. And I go to the checkout line, and it's almost my turn to go to the cashier. And I feel this, what now call a panic attack out of nowhere. It just came to me. I had this cold sweats and heart is pounding. I dissociate. I don't know where I am, what's happening. All I want to do is run away. And I have a fear of dying. I'm dying. And at that time already, people were worrying about, coronavirus. Mm-hmm. there was a woman in front of me and I said, I don't feel well, hoping that she could do something. But, people were distancing already. So she moved away and I just ran out of the store. I left my shopping cart and ran out of the store. So after that, I go to my primary care doctor, what's going on. They do a blood work and they told me that I had very low iron, 4, and it's very low. And that created so much anxiety and panic, even now as I speak about it. So when I went for blood work, they drew the blood. I don't know if it was I suggested myself or it really happened, but I don't know if it was because I didn't have enough iron. I had this physical experience, but I was in the doctor's office for about an hour and a half. Mm-hmm. In this full panic, cold, and they were trying to get me help. And now I have a severe fear because I have to get this blood work continuously done. And when I went the following time, which was a few months ago, the woman looked at me and said, you just lie down. We don't want you to pass out. I said, are you kidding me? You say that to me? I just ran. I just couldn't be in that office to do the blood work. So now I have this fear, anxiety. It's not a fear, it's an anxiety, but it's very severe. That is debilitating almost. I need to get my blood work done to know where I am with my iron and other things, but I can't get it done.
Mm-hmm. Well, so here we could even start with what I think is interesting about panic, because it sounds like, there's if I'm hearing this correctly, there's some panic in there.
Yes, it was. Yes.
What makes panic fall into the category of disorder is when we start worrying about and avoiding situations where we might have a panic attack. And
it's not the first time now, I have to admit. It happened a few times in this past 2 years that I go to some place to do something that I avoid and I run away. So this is becoming debilitating now.
Yeah. And causing major issues. So
yes.
So I think that's falling into the categories of what we've been talking about. So here, what folks have done that have used our Unwinding Anxiety program, for example, or even what I do in my clinic, is start by helping people first be able to map out those loops, like I just did with my patient, right? Mm-hmm. So if we were to map this out, if I'm hearing this correctly, even having the thought or the suggestion of getting a medical, getting your blood drawn, for example, triggers your avoidance behavior, whether you run out of it sounds like you ran out of the room that one time. Mm-hmm. And that running out helps you avoid from having, a panic attack. Am I getting that right?
Correct. Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So that's actually the first step of, being able to work with any of these things, is to map them out. The second step is, and if we think of anxiety more generally, one of the common mechanisms, whether it's panic disorder or generalized anxiety disorder, is worry. So, and the feeling of anxiety, that feeling of worry, that feeling of nervousness can trigger the mental behavior of worrying. So, for example, I don't know if this is true for you, but even having a little bit of a feeling of anxiety, does that trigger you to worry or even to panic? Does that?
Yeah, okay. Completely. And I do have a question about that. Where does it originate? Because sometimes it feels like it comes from my body, and there is nothing and no cues in my environment, that no one is drawing my blood, but I get anxious all of a sudden, or vice versa, right? Yeah. It starts cognitively and it just it becomes this snowball effect and it affects my body. Like I was in the doctor's office. I'm 100% sure that's what happened. I wasn't dying there. They measured my blood pressure. Everything was normal, but I was feeling like I was dying.
Yeah. That counts for a lot. So here, the why is, I'm glad you're asking this question, because a lot of folks have this idea that if they can just figure out what causes it, they can either avoid the causes or fix the causes. Now, I'm going to say something that might sound a little unusual to some folks, which is, from a neuroscientific standpoint, the why doesn't matter. And I say this as a board certified, psychiatrist, where, I learned a lot in residency about, psychodynamic psychotherapy or whatever, where we're looking at delving into people's past, for example. Well, if you look at the neuroscience equations, the past is not a variable in the equation. What keeps a behavior going is how rewarding it is. So the trigger doesn't determine how rewarding a behavior is. How the results of a behavior determine how rewarding the behavior is. So if you run away from a medical procedure, that's the behavior, and the result is that you don't have a panic attack, your brain could very easily interpret that as boy, that was pretty rewarding. And so it learns, hey, do that again. And the stronger the reward, the larger the reward, the greater the reward, the more that behavior gets reinforced. The trigger is kind of a bystander in the sense that it just kind of sets the whole thing in motion, but it's the least important part of the equation. Knowing what the trigger is certainly helpful, but trying to go and fix the trigger is kind of like, if our car is broken, going and working on our neighbor's car, and they say, hey, what are you doing? And I say, well, my car's broken. And they say, well, why are you working on my car? Well, I don't know.
Hey, do you love the podcast? Show your support by becoming a patron on patreon.com and join our 15 existing members who believe and support the work of authentic parenting. Patreon is a place where creators, artists, and podcasters get support from their fans. Your contribution makes a difference. When you become a patron at any level, I'll send you a handwritten thank you card with some awesome authentic parenting merch. A tote bag, a pen, a t-shirt, a mug. You'll be part of the special Insiders Circle and get other benefits as well. Discounts on my services and offerings, extra content, and of course, exclusive access to me. You can stop your contribution at any time. A lot goes into the production of the podcast, and I truly need your help. Head over to patreon.com/authentic parenting. The link is in your show notes as well. And join other big-hearted and generous listeners from around the world. It's not the amount that matters, it's the fact that you give that matters. After all, I created this podcast and built our community on the notion of giving. We have different levels of support starting from $2 a month. If you break it down, it comes down to 50 cents per episode. $2 can't even get you a cup of hot drink in a major US city. Thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for being part of our global, diverse, and strong community. Your support truly matters. Simply visit patreon.com/authentic parenting and choose a level of support today. Again, visit patreon.com/authentic parenting and choose a level of support. Now, back to the show. So what is the most important part then? Is it the change? Is changing the reward, right? Since we have the reward-based learning. So I can tell you another story, which based on your book, I want to fast forward. Your book and another person's work really helped me. And doing this podcast and interviewing amazing minds like yourself gave me a lot of information, feeling your feelings, leaning into your unpleasant experience, not avoiding it, doesn't matter. I'm also sharing the same view. The why doesn't matter. Just you have to ride the wave of this unpleasant feeling, right? In the moment. Yeah. So 2 years later, I'm in that store again, back, the same store, the same location. And I'm shopping and I'm very happy. And the moment I get to the checkout line again, I feel my body is almost, coming to this panic mode again. Mm-hmm. And I said to myself, which later I read in your book about curiosity, but I did apply in that moment, maybe not so effectively. but I understand that's what happened. I recognized it and I said, like, what's going to happen to me? Let me just be and sense my feelings. Where am I feeling the tightness, the coldness, and do some breathing. And then I saw a woman in front of me. She had this orange pants in her hands. I said, let me strike up a conversation with the stranger about this color. And I did. My anxiety didn't completely go away, but it diminished significantly. And I didn't have this full panic attack. So I think it was a successful event. Would you consider that I handled it correctly?
It sounds a lot more successful than the first time. Yeah. Yeah. And you're highlighting something really important, which is the only way to change a behavior is to, I think of this phrase, the only way out is through. And so instead of running away from it, or in the case where you literally ran out of the store, being with our thoughts and our emotions and our body sensations, that's how we get through it. And I think of curiosity as this superpower that really helps us be with our experience. So anybody listening can explore this for themselves. So if you're feeling anxious, there's that trigger that you just described, that contextual cue that says, reminds your brain, oh, last time I was here, I had a panic attack. Then you start to worry, or you start to feel these feelings. So if we have worry as a mental behavior, right, and that worry can drive more anxiety because it feels like we're doing something, but all we're doing is riling ourselves up. So if we compare worrying to being curious, right, curiosity, it's a no-brainer. Curiosity feels better. And so our brains, I think of it this way. Our brains pick what I call the BBO, the bigger, better offer. Our brains are going to pick something that is more rewarding if given a choice. And so if we're given a choice between worrying and curiosity, especially if we've had an opportunity to see that worrying hasn't helped, and in fact just makes things worse on average, then we start wondering, why am I worrying? Oh, it's just a habit. And then we start to get curious. Oh, what does anxiety feel like in my body? And so that actually helps us step out of the worry habit loop and into our direct experience. Oh, this is what's happening right now. And I think if I heard what you said correctly, you were saying you started to notice, you started to get curious.
Yes, I did. I was paying attention to my bodily sensations.
There it is.
And I want you to speak about that, because when someone reads your work, like superficially, they may misinterpret this key fundamental element, right? They may think that, oh, map out this, do this, do this. It's about doing step by step. And I've heard interviews where you talk and even the interviewer gets it wrong. They think it's a cognitive process. But I want you to emphasize that this is a sensory experience.
It is. So the stepwise process certainly is a cognitive, 1, 2, 3 process. But like you're pointing out, the experience of being curious is a sensory experience. And so just to be clear, because sometimes people can get caught in the idea of curiosity. There are actually two types of curiosity. One's called deprivation curiosity, which is very much a cognitive process where we have a lack of information. That's why it's called deprivation. We're deprived of information. And so we have this urge to go get that information. That's really different than the other type of curiosity, which is called I type or interest curiosity. And this is the curiosity that you and I are talking about. It's sensory, it's experiential, and we can tap into it by asking, instead of why is this happening, we ask, oh, what's happening in my body right now, right? And what that does is it helps awaken that curiosity. Instead of worry, which tends to lead us into the oh no scenario, like, oh no, am I going to have another panic attack? You can even hear the difference between the two. Oh, I'm about to have a panic attack. We can go, oh, here's some anxiety in my body right now. And we start to get curious about it. We can even, I like to have people ask questions like, oh, is it more on the right side or the left side of my body? Just as a way, doesn't matter where it is, but it helps somebody be able to access their sensory information and their sensory experience as compared to the old habit of running away from it. And that I-type curiosity, that interest, is critical because it helps people do a couple of things. One is it helps them see that the feelings of anxiety are just feelings in their body. And what that does is it helps give them perspective. When they can observe it, instead of thinking I'm anxious, they can really observe, oh, there are feelings in my body that my brain interprets as anxiety. And it's that, again, it doesn't even need to be a cognitive process. It's just, that's what happens is, oh, it's tightness, it's tension, it's burning. And they start to see, oh, these are just physical sensations. And importantly, they also see that these physical sensations come and go. They aren't something that are going to last forever. And it tends to feel like,
it tends to feel in that moment that it's going to last forever.
Yeah.
And just that discomfort alone makes you worry even more. But for me, anxiety feels a lot more on a somatic level than on a worry cognitive level. Are there people who have predispositions, or are there different flavors to anxiety?
I think for the majority of us, that somatic feeling, that's why it's described as a feeling of nervousness, a feeling of worry, a feeling of unease. We feel anxious. We don't think anxious. Yet, when we feel anxious, our thinking brain gets involved and starts to worry, because that's what our thinking brain does, is it thinks. And that worry is directing that fear toward the future. Oh no, what could happen?
So curiosity is the antidote to anxiety.
Yeah. And I would say it's the antidote in particular to worry, because when we feel the feelings of anxiety, we can either kind of prolong them, whether we run away or we resist them. I like that phrase, what we resist persists. Mm-hmm. So if we run away from them, they're going to run after us. If we push against them, they're going to push back. Curiosity helps us change our relationship to the anxiety, so we don't slip into the habitual patterns of worrying or avoiding, or a lot of my patients get referred to me for drinking too much alcohol because they're using that as a way to numb themselves, or overeating or binge eating or whatever. It's really, the curiosity helps us change our relationship so that we can be with our anxiety instead of habitually trying to do something to make it go away.
Yeah. How about awareness? I mean, it requires awareness to tap into that curiosity, correct? If I am not able to do that, it's hard to access curiosity in that moment. I've tried in a different situation, and it's very difficult. It's very difficult. It seems inaccessible. I'd rather stay in my anxiety and brew in it than it feels like curiosity is unattainable.
Yes. Isn't that interesting? Right?
It is very interesting, even though I know it's going to be helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. So there can be a number of reasons that this happens. One of them is that when we are familiar with something, even if it's uncomfortable, just that familiarity is comfort for us. It's like that, oh, we're used to this comfort, comfort food, comfort blanket, comfort whatever, because we've had it before, we know what it does. And so there's this weird irony that we get so comfortable with being anxious that when we even imagine stepping out of it, that change is scary. And I've had patients, even this gentleman, Dave, that I spoke about before, he had anxiety basically for 30 years. He was about 40 years old when he came to see me. And when about 5-6 months into treatment, he came in for a visit and was talking about how he was basically getting anxious that he wasn't anxious. He would have prolonged periods of time of calm and peace, and they felt so uncomfortable because they were so unfamiliar to him that he would start to worry. Oh, why aren't I anxious? Shouldn't I be anxious right now? And then, we talked through how, that was just him moving outside of his comfort zone. And that if he recognized, he was in his growth zone, he was learning, he was in a different space. And if he just stayed there a little bit longer, which he eventually learned to do, that new zone where that peace, the comfort became his new habit. And so he became comfortable just because it was familiar. And so anything that we try that's different is going to alert our brain and to these danger signals, because anything that's different, we have to check first to see if it's dangerous or not. So our brain goes and it does its danger scan. And if we can help our brain do that by saying, oh, this is just different. See, look around. There's nothing dangerous here. I'm not about to get hit by a car or anything. Then that helps us relax into the space and then even lean into it and think, oh, instead of, oh no, this is different. Oh, this is different. And we're now in our growth zone. And then eventually, the more we lean into that curiosity, the more curiosity becomes our new habit itself. That's a pretty amazing place to be.
How many repetitions does it require? Is it personal, or like what do you see through the apps and things like that? Does this require a lot of practice?
Well, like you had said, it's somewhat personal, but we can do scientific studies to look at general changes. So, for example, when we studied our Unwinding Anxiety app, we found in general, when people with generalized anxiety disorder, we could get a 67% reduction in anxiety in 2 months, which was mind-boggling. I never expected it to work that well. As compared to our control group, this is a randomized controlled trial. The control group that got usual care, going to their clinician, getting medications, whatever, they showed a 14% reduction. So some reduction, about what I'd expect, on average with usual care. But here we got a 67% reduction. So we could look into that to see, how this was happening and how quickly it could happen. And here we looked at our Eat Right Now app, where we could actually look at changes in reward value in the brain. Well, in people's experience, their self-report, but it's a marker of what our brain is doing. And here we would have people pay attention as they overate. And it only took 10 to 15 times of somebody really paying attention as they overate for that reward value to drop below zero and for them to start shifting their behavior from overeating to not overeating. We saw similar results we have this app called Craving to Quit for smoking. We saw similar results when people were really paying attention as they were smoking. So people could start to see, overeating, well, it doesn't really feel that good. Cigarettes taste like crap, and they start to get disenchanted. That reward value shifts. Remember, reward-based learning is based on rewards. That shift helps them start to change their behavior. For some people, it can happen pretty quickly. I remember somebody in one of our early studies, he'd been smoking 30 cigarettes a day. We had him pay attention as he smoked, and he was able to drop 20 cigarettes within 2 days. So it was from a Monday to a Thursday. So within 3 days. And he reported he would smoke, at all these times of day. And for example, coffee for him was bitter. And so he'd smoke a cigarette after he drank his coffee in the morning. And he realized, he just paid attention. He's like, well, I could brush my teeth instead. So he could see all the ways where he could just drop a cigarette and not, actually his life would be better. So here, depending on how much we pay attention and how much suffering it's causing, for lack of a better way of putting it, if something's really causing us a lot of suffering and we really pay attention, that behavior change, that shift can happen pretty quickly. Like I mentioned, we just published the study 10 to 15 times with our Eat Right Now app. That's relatively rapid.
These numbers with your success stories are just incredible, phenomenal. What's the success rate with medication? And what kinds of medications are used to treat anxiety? Because I know a lot of people in our community, we have a Facebook group. One woman particularly keeps changing medications for this and that and this and that, and nothing is working. So I'm assuming it's not going to be as successful with medication, the success rate compared to this app.
Yes, we haven't directly compared them. So I don't know the head-to-head answer, which would be the best way to answer that scientifically. What I can say is when we look at the numbers, I'd mentioned, it's about 1 in 5 patients that shows a significant reduction in symptoms for anxiety. And the medications, I think the gold standard class right now is selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs. So
and do you still prescribe medication?
I do. Yes.
Oh,
yes.
you do?
Yeah. And for some people, medications are lifesavers, and for other people, not so much. In the study that we did that I mentioned, where we got a 67% reduction, that number needed to treat, for medications, it's 5.2. In this study, it was 1.6. Again, not a head-to-head comparison, but when you do the calculations that help give a sense for how well something works, lower is better. A smaller number is definitely better. So here I think of it as, for some patients, medications are really helpful. And like I said, I prescribe medications. For everyone, learning how our mind works and learning how to work with our minds is really beneficial because we all share that same learning mechanism.
So I have a question then. I quit coffee. I was addicted to coffee. I guess you can say it's an addiction, right? It's a habit that turns into an addiction over time for maybe 30 years of my life, maybe more. I decided to quit coffee in one day and I did it. It was very simple, very easy. And then one day my husband still drinks coffee. I said, he made extra. I said, let me indulge myself. Let me see. And I'm like, oh, how could I have drunk all this yucky, disgusting drink all my life and have been like craving and addicted. And every morning I would get up and think of coffee. So dropping this habit of drinking coffee was super easy for me. I started exercising with the trainer. I go once a week, then I went twice a week. It was very easy to establish this habit. What I'm getting is, are there personal differences? And I'm not sure if you've looked at this, but I mean, I'm curious about your opinion, your thoughts, not scientific data. Why can't I beat my anxiety habit the same way I'm able to do those habits? Like I can go cold turkey. It's very easy for me to do those kind of habits, whether positive or negative. But with this anxiety, I'm struggling. Are there personal differences in terms of, are there people more prone to addiction than others? Are there people more like me who can decide and quit something like very quickly? Like what's your take on this? And whether you are familiar with Gretchen Rubin's framework of the 4 personality tendencies. I'm curious, like, are there differences in this? There must be.
Yes, I would think, this is what makes humanity interesting. If we were all clones, it would be much less of an interesting existence. So certainly there are individual differences in our genes and our environment, how we were raised, et cetera, et cetera. And those, if we look at the genes in particular, we don't really have a lot of control over those, at least not yet, right? But what we do have control over is our own, what's happening, how we're reacting to our genes and our environment right now. And so here, I think of it as, we can, there are some things that are easier for one person and not for another. There's some things that are easier for one person to do, like you're talking about, like starting your habit of going to the gym, and then it's harder to work with the anxiety. It brings up a curiosity of mine, which is to look at the emotional valence of things. So for example, some people might hear your story about quitting coffee and say, there's no way I could do that. I've tried.
I was that person all my life. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, some people have, when they try, they get the caffeine withdrawal headache. They get, these really strong psychological cravings, and it's just too much for them. And so if you look at the emotional, the intensity of what the results are, remember, results are what drive behaviors. If you look at that, the more intense it is, the harder it often is for somebody to change a habit. So for example, your panic and anxiety sounded pretty intense. Whereas I didn't hear any crazy panic attacks when you stopped drinking coffee.
No, there were none. I just quit, and I felt bad, terribly, a little headache and things like that the following 2 days.
Mm-hmm.
And then I always thought, oh, I'm not going to have energy in the morning and all of that. Just the opposite. I have, great energy. My mood is, in fact, I have more stability in my energy level.
Mm-hmm.
My generalized anxiety is gone completely. I would feel the jitters, the anxiety throughout the day. It's completely gone.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the reason I quit coffee, because of my anxiety. But now my anxiety and this panic thing is more circumstantial.
Yeah.
And I don't know when it may come up again.
Yeah.
So that worries me, right? Because I don't know. Like, I was going to a yoga studio the other day, and it's on the second floor, and it's a very narrow stairwell, and it's a narrow building. I go up there and I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't breathe. I just wanted to run away again. But I stayed curious, and I said, I've been, absorbing your content for the past 2 weeks. So I didn't force myself. But I stayed with the feeling, and I was curious, and I went to the yoga studio door, and it was closed, and I left again. But man, it was like a Herculean task to just go through that experience. But what's going to happen to me? Like, it's just like 10 steps.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a narrow place. Like, I survived an earthquake. I guess I don't want to go into the why, but maybe these things are, related to, but I was able to do that. I didn't run away, but it's a simple thing. Why would I be debilitated, even climb the stairs?
Yes. And that's
right?
where, that's the mystery of our brains and our minds, where, for one person, it's just a stairwell. For another person, it's Mount Everest, and in the moment, it feels like it's impossible to climb. Yet, as you're pointing out, that journey of 1,000 miles starts with the first step. And so it's like, you brought in some curiosity, you took a step, your head didn't explode, you took another step, and you made it to the door.
Yeah. Yeah. So where does breathing come into place? Do you, because I rely on breathing to control my nervous system. And we've done a lot of episodes on this podcast about nervous system regulation. Do you think it's important, or in your model, you don't talk about it a lot?
Well, certainly breathing is helpful for survival. I don't think that's what you're talking about.
No.
So certainly there's a lot of work done, around breathing and helping to get that, sinus arrhythmia and jack up the parasympathetic, nervous system and all those things. I'll leave that to the experts that really focus on that. With mindfulness, it's really about jacking up the curiosity. So we could be curious about how we're breathing. Often when somebody is anxious, they tend to breathe shallowly or hold their breath. And I'm sure many folks notice that. So even just being curious about that and noticing the difference between, breathing shallowly and maybe taking a few deep breaths and what the difference there is. Here, though, the emphasis really is on curiosity, mapping out these anxiety habit loops, and then really focusing in using the curiosity to help us see what we're getting. And that helps us become disenchanted with the old habits, for example, with worrying, like we talked about. And it also helps us to build the new habit of curiosity itself.
Yeah. What's that question that you ask? What am I getting out of this?
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So bringing the curiosity in, if we're worrying, and as you pointed out before, really moving into our direct experience when we ask the question, what am I getting from this? And so what that does is it helps us link up that cause and effect relationship between worrying and the feeling of being more anxious, so that we can show our brains, oh, when I worry, I actually get more anxious.
And you also talk about compassion. You say kindness, but can you speak about that too?
Yes. So often I see, whether it's somebody that's anxious or somebody that's struggling with something else, we are really good at judging ourselves, especially in the Western world. And so what I have people do is map out their self-judgment habit loops in the same way that they map out worry habit loops. It's often a thought, oh, I did something, and then there's the trigger, and then they judge themselves, there's the behavior, and then the result likely is some flavor of, well, it's over, I did it, but I can at least beat myself up over it, and that feels like I'm in control, or I'm at least doing something, right? And so that is more rewarding than not doing something, and so that feeds back and somebody gets in that loop. So mapping that out and then comparing what it's like to judge ourselves versus to simply be kind to ourselves. Again, no brainer, kindness feels better. And so here we can help ourselves step out of these self-judgmental habit loops just by bringing some kindness in, or some self-compassion, as you were talking about.
So if we create a regular mindfulness practice, or formal or informal meditation practice, or, like loving kindness or being self-compassionate throughout the day, do you think it's helpful in those moments or we have to do this in the moment when we feel like I feel this anxiety?
We've found that informal practices mediate the decoupling of the trigger and the behavior more than formal practices, though we've also found that both are helpful. So I think of it as short moments many times. That's how we form any new habit. So if somebody's struggling with anxiety in the moment, it's a great opportunity to take a moment to get curious. And we can also, if we have time, and this is where often, it's a privilege to be able to even take 15 minutes or 20 minutes a day to meditate, because many people, if they're working 2 or 3 jobs, or, a single mom raising kids by herself, they don't have those moments. They don't have that extra time. So, it's a privilege to take some time to practice, and that can also help and provide a foundation for helping us develop the habit of being aware.
How about you? I know you struggled with anxiety and even panics in the past. Have you overcome all your anxieties now? Are you adept at mapping yours and being curious? Like, how is this work personal for you and helpful in your personal life?
Yeah. So I used to get panic attacks when I was in residency. I certainly still feel anxiety. I think that's a human characteristic. Yet I relate to these much differently now. So when I feel panic coming on, I can get curious about it. When I feel anxiety coming on, I can get curious about it. So I feel like my relationship to these are very, very different. And, certainly it's probably helped me not develop full-blown panic disorder, because I can just notice the sensations, get curious, and they go away relatively quickly on their own. I don't have to do anything but notice. And when there's anxiety, bringing in that curiosity is really, really helpful for the same thing, just noticing and not keeping those feelings around by resisting them or running away from them.
Yeah. So if we were to summarize all of this for the listener, I hope we didn't lose their attention. What are the 3 steps again to the model?
Yes. So first, it's about mapping a habit loop. What's the trigger? What's the behavior? What's the result? The second is asking that question, what am I getting from this? And really diving into our direct experience so we can see the cause and effect relationship. What's the result? How rewarding is this? Or how unrewarding is this? And then the third step is bringing in that bigger, better offer. When we're worrying, when we're doing whatever our avoidant behavior is, instead of doing that, can we actually bring curiosity in as the new behavior and get curious about the anxiety itself, or get curious about the panic itself?
Are there ways to cultivate curiosity in general? Are there people who are not curious naturally? I would think it's a human trait, right? We've evolved to be curious.
Yes.
But some people are more curious than others. They preserve sort of that childlike wonder, curiosity, a sense of awe than others due to their life circumstances, I guess. Is it possible to deepen a sense of curiosity, and how, if you know any studies or research that you have done?
Yes, I think this is a an emerging field of research in terms of how to foster curiosity. I think of it as kind of awakening the curiosity that we all have, as compared to trying to get more of it. Like you're saying, this is an innate human quality. We all have curiosity. It helps us survive. So here it's about awakening it, and then also just reflecting on it in the same way that we can become disenchanted with some of these old habits, like worrying. We can notice what we get from being curious. And, I love, there was a quote, I think it was Dorothy Parker or somebody that said that curiosity will conquer fear more than, no, I'm mixing this up with my other favorite quote about curiosity. Curiosity is the cure for boredom. There is no cure for curiosity. Which is
great.
Yeah, isn't that great?
It's
so what
great.
she's pointing out is curiosity actually feels really, really good. And the more curious we are, and the more we notice how good it feels, the more that's going to feed back to our brain and say, hey, that's good. Do that again. To the point where this brings in the other quote that I was about to say, which is, we can learn to see how curiosity is like a superpower. So James Stephens, who is an Irish poet and author, wrote that curiosity will conquer fear even more than bravery will.
Wow.
And so that's how strong it can be when we really build up and awaken that curiosity.
Yeah, so we should be mindful not to kill it in our children then.
Yes, for sure.
Well, I want to thank you for your time, Dr. Jud. This was really enlightening, curiosity, interest-provoking, eye-opening. I really interested in your work. I think many people need solutions for anxiety. That this is fantastic. I love your work. I am going to get curious about my anxieties furthermore, because I have to do colonoscopy and other things as we get older. So thank you so much for your time, for your presence, for your wisdom, and for all the wonderful work that you do. You're very prolific, all the apps, and we'll have everything in the show notes so people can get the book, the apps, and get familiar with your work. Thank you so much.
No, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
That concludes today's interview, my dear listener, and I hope you enjoyed it. What's your biggest takeaway? Did you find it useful? I not only enjoyed this interview, but learned so much. What did you learn? If you loved this episode, then check out Dr. Jud's book, Unwinding Anxiety. It's an incredibly relatable and practical guide. I love hearing from you. How are you enjoying the podcast? What are your recent favorite episodes and topics? I welcome your feedback, comments, and questions. You can send me a note to the email info@authenticparenting.com. You can send a voicemail to the number 732-763-2576. And for you, my international listener, there is a free tool on the contact page of my website. Go to authenticparenting.com/contact and send your feedback. If you enjoyed the podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts and rating it on Spotify, which is a new feature, or by becoming a patron on patreon.com. With a small monthly contribution, you can support your favorite show and get supporter-only benefits, content, and exclusive access to me. You can find the show and follow it wherever podcasts are played: Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, Spotify, and elsewhere. And you can connect with me on Instagram, the only social media platform that I use. Until next week, connect to the present moment, to yourself and your children. I am Anna Seewald. Thank you so much for listening.